ravaging the East since 1937 and Japan's invasion of China, reached Europe on the 1st of September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. It became global on the 7th of December 1941 when Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. It touched every continent and lasted for 6 years. It ended with a new weapon for a new age. This is the history of the greatest of all man-made events. These men are part of that history. They are eyewitnesses to the triumphs and tragedies of the war wherever it was fought. Their testimony is part of the story of how our world was made. By those who could pay and those who could no longer meet. The price of empire. In the middle of 1942, the war in Europe would reach its halfway point and its turning point. It had taken Hitler half a war to occupy a tenth of the world's surface and control a population roughly equivalent to that of the United States of America. Half a war to gain an empire. It would take him half a war to lose one. Japan also reached the halfway point with a vast empire. It had scorched across the Asia-Pacific region until it occupied a sixth of the Earth's surface. Then it too started the tumble towards destruction. It is inconceivable, Winston Churchill had declared in 1925, that in our lifetime and in that of our children, Japan could pose a threat to the security of the British Empire in the East. As late as 1939, he was being reassuring about possible Japanese designs on Singapore. There will, he promised, be no attack in any period which our foresight can measure. But there was. The southern resources area was vital to Japan. The price of silk, still Japan's principal export, had dropped by 50% since the Great Depression, and she was resource poor. Something had to be done. By 1938, military spending absorbed 75% of Japanese government expenditure. She launched not one attack, but many. The United States lost the use of all of its Pacific battleships and large numbers of cruisers and destroyers. The British and Dutch Far Eastern fleets had been eliminated, and the Royal Australian Navy had been driven back to port. Japan had lost not a single battleship, aircraft carrier, heavy or light cruiser. It had gained resources of great importance, including 70% of the world's tin supply, most of its production of natural rubber, and the oil output of the Dutch East Indies, which at the time exceeded that of Iran and California combined. It had done this in a single onslaught fought as two campaigns, in Asia and in the Pacific. We will look first at the Asian offensive that conquered Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The day after Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft operating out of Vietnam bombed Singapore, and the Philippines was bombed by planes flying out of Taiwan. The new territories were invaded in the first part of the capture of Hong Kong, and the two British capital ships in the area, Prince of Wales and Repulse, sailed from Singapore to contest Japanese landings on the Malay Peninsula. They had no air cover, and on the 10th of December, both were sent to the bottom by waves of attacking Japanese aircraft. Thailand, then known as Siam, was occupied on December the 9th and formally allied itself with Japan on the 14th.
Siam, another self-styled neutral who frequently announced her intention of defending herself against aggression, she too has given way.
The Imperial Japanese Army could now march through Thailand en route to Burma, a journey that they would attempt to hasten by construction of the Burma-Thailand Railway, which was to become so notorious. On December the 15th, Japanese troops entered Burma. The full-scale invasion would be launched in January. On December the 16th, they landed in Borneo. On the 18th, they crossed onto Hong Kong Island. By the 7th of January, the Japanese had Sarawak. They landed on the Celebes a couple of days later, and British North Borneo fell on the 19th.
This is a world war, and none can tell how far it may spread. So the Dutch Empire in the Far East prepares.
The Dutch East Indies, which generated 1/7 of the Netherlands' economy, was a particularly crucial objective of the Japanese campaign. Its annual production of 65 million barrels of oil had the potential to transform Japan's ability to wage a protracted war. But the Dutch destroyed the wells. On the Malay Peninsula, General Tomoyuki Yamashita's 25th Imperial Japanese Army was advancing. Yamashita, whose exploits would earn him the sobriquet Tiger of Malaya, had 150 tanks. They were not very good tanks, which did not matter. The British forces opposing him had no tanks at all. British defences, weakened by supply of resources to the war in Europe, crumbled. The Japanese advance through Malaya followed two lines: across the Thai border and down the west coast, and from the landings at Kota Bharu following the east coast. The British in Malaya formed defensive lines but failed to extend their flanks. They had not learned the lesson of the German blitzkrieg through the Ardennes, and just as on the European battlefield, their flanks were quickly turned by enemy troops infiltrating through supposedly impassable areas, in this case, the jungle. On December 31st, the last of the British and Commonwealth forces crossed the causeway, evacuating Malaya and garrisoning the island fortress of Singapore. The greatest disaster in British imperial history was less than 2 months away. By mid-January, the Commander-in-Chief of ABDACOM, the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, General Wavell, who had been kicked sideways from North Africa, was ordering Arthur Percival, the General Officer commanding Malaya, to prepare Singapore for a siege. Before Singapore fell, Japanese forces working their way through the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, hopped from island to island, suppressing what resistance they found. Small garrisons of Dutch and other forces had been sent to defend some of these islands, but their position was hopeless, the planning rudimentary and their equipment inadequate. The fate of Gull Force, an Australian formation sent to support Dutch troops on the island of Ambon, was typical. Gull Force reached Ambon on December 17th, just 2 weeks before the Japanese.
There were only about 1,100 of us, and there would have been only about that many Dutch-led Ambonese soldiers. So the action was very, very brief, and come the end of January, early February, the Dutch capitulated, and because Australians had no option but to do likewise. So that's when I became a prisoner of war.
The survivors were marching into 3 years of harsh captivity. The first Japanese landing on Singapore on February the 8th occurred less than a week after the fall of Ambon. 4 days later, a ship carrying Australian nurses and wounded evacuated from Singapore was bombed by Japanese aircraft and sank. Most of the survivors reached Bangka, an island like Ambon in the Dutch East Indies. An officer from their ship surrendered to the Japanese, who ordered the 22 nurses and 1 civilian woman to wade into the surf. When they were waist deep, they were machine gunned. All but Sister Vivian Bullwinkle were killed. Sister Bullwinkle survived the war and gave evidence before the War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo. Of the massacre, she said, "We just marched into the surf and they fired at us. There were no tears, for we knew it was our lot." The day before the Bangka Island massacre on the 15th of February, General Percival had surrendered the Singapore garrison of 130,000 troops to an invading army half that size. Facing a numerically superior enemy and having taken about the same number of casualties, 9,000, as the defenders, Yamashita's call on the British to surrender or face destruction was an enormous bluff. But General Arthur Percival, baggy shorts, scarecrow frame and trim moustache, perfectly designed to be the scapegoat for such a disaster, had mainly raw troops without air cover with which to meet battle-hardened Japanese. His concern for the safety of Singapore's 1 million civilians overrode any other judgment, and he marched into captivity at the head of his force, many of whom would suffer dreadfully in the years ahead. Yamashita could hardly believe his luck, and said so. As far as Japanese public opinion was concerned, the improbable collapse of the British Empire in the East meant, quite simply, victory. After the surrender of Singapore, the headline of the Asahi Shimbun newspaper trumpeted, "Situation of Pacific War decided," and the jubilant Japanese government distributed treats to all the children.
勝ったというのでね、なんか非常に日本が勝って東南アジアの方や南方の方も皆占領したりして、一方的な宣伝だからね、インドネシアやらアジアの国々が欧米勢力に虐げられてたのが皆独立してね、日本語を勉強したりしてみんな一生懸命やってるよいうふうな宣伝ばかりだったから、そんなふうに信じてたんじゃないかね、やっぱりね。
With the fall of Singapore, 55,000 Indian soldiers of the king were taken prisoner. 40,000 of them volunteered to fight in the Indian National Army, a Japanese creation under the respected leader Subhas Chandra Bose, which purported to be fighting the British for Indian independence. Later in 1942, Winston Churchill was to say in a speech in London, "I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire." But of course, he had.
This war changed everything. End of the British Empire. They won the war, but they lost the empire.
The pomp and circumstance by which a few thousand held several million in their sway had been exposed for the frail bluff it was. The empire was on the canvas, and though it would rise again, it would be, as they say, as a dead man walking. The Japanese catch cry, "We are all Asians," their claim to be on a crusade to evict the white man from Asia, had immediate resonance. But, like Hitler in Europe, the Japanese knew how to conquer but not how to keep an empire. Soon they were hated and resented more violently than had been the colonial masters. Taking food from Chinese mouths, taking Korean women into sexual slavery, using Filipinos for bayonet practice was hardly the way. But those they conquered would not return to the arms of their previous masters. When the fighting ended, there would be new paths to follow. The Dutch colonial government relocated to Australia at the beginning of March as the tsunami of Japanese conquest rolled through the East Indies, effectively collapsing the Dutch Empire. West from the Dutch Indies and from Malaya, the battle was for Burma, and that battle threatened to prise open the door to India. Japanese aircraft operating out of Thailand had launched the first bombing raid on the capital, Rangoon, on the 23rd of December. Japanese reinforcements arrived through January and began to press towards the capital. Moulmein, celebrated in the poetry of Rudyard Kipling, fell at the end of the month.
We knew that we cannot sit on the frontier all the time. We have to go. This little feeling of the withdrawal from Burma was taken as a personal touching point that we, after all, fought. But now nobody thinks we fought because we came back. And the feeling was that we must get a chance to at least settle with the Japanese that they are no better than us.
The troops opposing the Japanese advance were mainly Indian divisions, which, combined with British units, comprised the Burma Army. In the north of the country were the Chinese 5th and 6th Armies, commanded by the American General Joe Stilwell, an astringent character known as Vinegar Joe. The Japanese entered Rangoon on March the 5th. 2 weeks later, a new general was put in command of 1st Burma Corps. His name was William Slim.
But the Japanese is a tough enemy, and much must be done before he will admit defeat.
By the end of April, the Japanese had cut the Burma Road. General Stilwell began his march south to reunite with Allied forces. On May the 15th, he crossed into Assam in British India. 5 days later, after the longest withdrawal in British military history, 1,000 kilometres, Bill Slim led Burma Corps across the border into India. The men looked, Slim said, like scarecrows, but, he added, they looked like soldiers too.
We did not want the Japanese to come and take over India, because there was a general feeling that the Japanese will be much worse. One person is evil, but the other is even more evil.
It has been said that the winter saved the Russians, and in Burma, the monsoon saved the British. It would be 6 months before the fight there was resumed.
19歳、20歳になったらね、これ兵隊検査あるでしょ。だからね、20歳の時にね、第37部隊入隊して、そこでビルマン行く編成に会うてね、人間やっぱり恐怖心もあるし、それ蛇がやね、いいかこの蛇やから猛毒持っとってさ、怖かったですな。名乗り刺されて、ザリガニみたいなやつはこれもう死にますわな、猛毒系さかい。まだ家の中にいるサソリはね、前切って弱いと思って、ああサソリや言うたら捕まえたら尻尾でガーッてやって尻尾で刺されて半日やしびれ、俺見ていらんことするさかい見てサソリ刺しちゃったりで半日しびれてもうてからね、こうやって歩いてましたよ。
The Japanese advance through the islands of the Pacific had happened in the same months as their onslaught on Asia and the East Indies, and it had met with a similarly great measure of success. Almost half of the Earth's water surface is the Pacific Ocean. It covers an area greater than all of the land masses combined. Its scale dwarfs the scattered parcels of dry land that rise above its waves. But it was the existence of these islands that made extending the co-prosperity sphere into the Pacific feasible. Because a ring of fortified islands made the empire defensible. And at Versailles, some of those islands had been gifted to Japan. The Marshall, Carolines and Marianas were former German colonies. 2 American outposts upset the integrity of that defensive ring. They were Wake and Guam. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed on Guam, which had surrendered by 6 o'clock the same morning. The first Japanese assault on Wake was beaten off by a well-entrenched defense. Stronger attempt on December the 23rd succeeded, and Wake surrendered that day. The day before, December 22nd, the main Japanese landings on Luzon signaled the commencement of the battle for the Philippines. The American commander, General Douglas MacArthur, had 130,000 men in uniform. But 100,000 were Filipinos who had been trained in close order drill. They could salute, but had never been in a fight. MacArthur began to withdraw his forces. By the 5th of January, he had successfully established 1 American and 7 Filipino divisions, 80,000 men, at Bataan, where they came under sustained Japanese attack. By the 22nd of January, MacArthur was ordering the withdrawal of forces to his final defensive line, an operation completed on the 26th. On the 8th of February, Filipino President Quezon proposed to President Roosevelt that his country be granted complete independence so that he could proclaim Filipino neutrality, which he hoped would oblige both American and Japanese forces to leave. President Roosevelt, advocate of self-determination in the Atlantic Charter, rejected Quezon's proposal but said that Filipino troops were free to surrender if they wished. He said that American forces would fight to the end. President Quezon left the Philippines on February the 20th. General MacArthur left on March the 11th. Both men went to Australia. The Japanese continued to reinforce their invasion, opening a fierce offensive against Bataan on April the 3rd. On the 9th of April, the Allied forces on Bataan surrendered. 78,000 men were marched into captivity. This was the Bataan Death March, more than 100 kilometers under the scorching sun with hardly any food or water. Amongst those who marched into captivity were 12,000 Americans, barely a third of whom would survive Japanese imprisonment. Fighting elsewhere in the Philippines, Mindanao, Luzon, Corregidor, continued. But by the 5th of May, General Wainwright was obliged to surrender the 15,000-man garrison on Corregidor. 5 days later, on May the 10th, the last Allied troops in the Philippines surrendered. Japanese troops had begun landing on New Guinea on March the 8th. Further landings followed, and on March the 22nd, Japanese planes bombed the northern Australian port city of Darwin.
It was obvious that the Japanese were on their way to invade us, and everything was haste. And it was no trouble to get into the army, as long as you coughed okay, and that you could see black or white, you were in without any question. And at the time I got in, it was a week before my 19th birthday.
By the time Douglas MacArthur had established his command in Brisbane, the situation he faced was almost entirely black. virtually the whole of the Southwest Pacific Command area was now in Japanese hands. Germany's first commitment that America had made at the Washington Conference meant that he had limited strength on which to rely. But one national leader, at least, was determined to face the Japanese challenge as an overriding priority.
The full cabinet today directed the War Cabinet to gazette the necessary regulations for the complete mobilization of all the resources, human and material, in this Commonwealth for the defense of this Commonwealth. That means that every human being in this country is now, whether he or she likes it, at the service of the government to work in the defense of Australia.
John Curtin, the Australian Prime Minister, exercised his right in a fiery confrontation with Churchill to withdraw Australian troops from the European war to fight the enemy on his doorstep. By March 1942, the majority of Australian troops were back home, ready to fight in the Pacific. In determining which strategy Japan should now follow, men in Tokyo had disagreed. Naval staff had pressed for occupation of the southern part of New Guinea, from where action could be launched against New Caledonia, Fiji and Samoa, extending and strengthening the defensive perimeter and isolating Australia from United States.